Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Zeeva Bukai about her 2 novels, Anatomy of Exile and The World Between, both published in the last year, and each of which contain fragments of her family history.
When I think of family history, I think of a plate dropped, shattered, and you're trying to put the pieces together. So that history felt so alive for me. It's something that I grew up with. So when I was writing The Anatomy of Exile, all of that history kind of bled into the novel.
Since this episode was recorded, The Anatomy of Exile was chosen as the winner of the 2025 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Zeeva's latest book, The World Between, was released just a few weeks ago. Zeeva Bukai's stories have appeared in Carve Magazine, The Masters Review, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, and elsewhere. Her honors include a fellowship at the New York Center for Fiction, residencies at Hedgebrook Writers Colony, and Birdcliff Air Program in Woodstock, New York. She is the recipient of the Masters Review Fall Fiction Prize, the Kurt Johnson Prose Award, and the Lilith Fiction Award. Today, we'll be discussing both novels, as well as her 5 books. In this episode, Zeeva shares her thoughts about Nicole Krauss Great House.
I think this idea of collective memory is what makes us a people. Our memory is a repository, and it is this huge great house. And we all have, whether it's Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, all of us have this collective unconscious.
And Zeeva will give us a master class on Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis.
And I read Kafka as a Jewish reader. I know that he's kind of been adopted by the rest of the world, but I really see Kafka as a Jewish writer. The idea of suddenly waking up as vermin, as a roach, I just feel like Kafka understood what it meant to be the other in society.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Zeeva. I'm really happy to talk to you. I was fully captivated by Anatomy of Exile, which, as we'll discuss, is a story about border-crossing relationships. There's an Ashkenazi and Mizrahi couple. There are 2 Israeli and Palestinian relationships, and you just kept raising the stakes with every narrative twist, and it felt so layered and complex and nuanced and really just a gift in the last 2 years to be able to sit with these characters and feel them aching for home, really. So I was very excited to read The World Between, which is totally different, but you can see your same gifts working in a different register, the same compassion, the same moral patience, the same faith in fiction as bearing witness. So welcome, and I'm happy to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you for that introduction to both of those books. I really do feel that fiction does bear witness and that there's an emotional truth in fiction that we could really get at, whereas in nonfiction, you're kind of hampered in by factual truth.
Your books really do that so well. I was hoping you could give us a sentence or two to describe both books, maybe one at a time, and then you called them Irish twins. I want to know how you came to publish them so close together.
Right. So it took me a long time to write The Anatomy of Exile, probably about 10 years, and then it took another 6 for it to get published. And so during that 6-year period, I began The World Between and basically finished that even before The Anatomy of Exile came out. And my agent gave it to Joe Olshan at Delphinium Books. And Joe said, absolutely, we're going to publish this. And I hadn't realized it was going to come out literally 1 year after The Anatomy of Exile. So it's a little strange. It feels, and not just that, but the paperback of Anatomy just came out in January. So all of this is happening. It's joyous and stressful at the same time.
So they are different books. Can you give us like a 2-sentence description of each one?
Sure. So The Anatomy of Exile is about an Israeli family that immigrates to the United States after the death of a beloved sister. Hadass is killed in what appears to be a terror attack, but is in fact a love affair with a Palestinian poet that ends in tragedy. Salim is so distraught over the death of his sister that he uproots the family of Tamar and their 3 children to the United States. And he promises her that after 5 years, they're going to return to Israel, wealthy as kings. They're going to buy a villa in Herzliya, and it's all going to be like this wonderful life that they're going to have. And they reach the U.S., and the book picks up 5 years later, and a Palestinian family moves into the apartment upstairs. And Ruby, Tamar and Salim's daughter, falls in love with the Palestinian son Faisal. And Tamar does everything in her power to separate the two. And that kind of creates a series of events that have the ability and I guess the power to completely destroy the relationship she has with her daughter, the marriage she has with Salim, and the family that she has desperately tried to keep intact. That's basically the anatomy in a nutshell. The world between is something else entirely. So the world between is about a former Yiddish stage actress. She's about 66 years old. And after the breakup of her marriage to her husband, Max, who is a Yiddish playwright, she returns to Israel to the apartment that she shared with him when they first married. Soon after, she finds herself in a sanitarium in Jaffa, run by a group of nuns, and she has no idea how she got there. And so the entire story is her piecing together the events that led her to this moment.
If you're someone who's drawn to thoughtful conversations about politics, culture, leadership, and Jewish identity, there's a podcast I think you'll really appreciate. It's called Identity Crisis from the Shalom Hartman Institute. Each week, host Yehuda Kurtzer brings a rare combination of moral rigor and genuine curiosity to the biggest questions facing Jewish life. Yehuda has also been a guest on the 5 Books, where we talked about his unusual upbringing as the child of a diplomat and about falling in love with 2nd century Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. Yehuda sits down with a wide range of guests on his show, people like Harvard University President Alan Garber, author Sarah Hurwitz, and writer Franklin Foer, to talk through the big questions around Jewish life and identity today. What makes Identity Crisis stand out is that it doesn't rush to easy answers. Instead, it creates space for disagreement and nuance to talk about the most pressing issues of this Jewish moment, like leadership in polarized times, Israel and the Jewish people, free speech, or what responsibility looks like when values collide. If you're looking for a podcast creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life, I'd really recommend checking out Identity Crisis with Yehuda Kurtzer, wherever you get your podcasts. Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, The Endless Step by Esther Hautzig.
I think I read The Endless Step by Esther Hautzig. I was probably in the 5th or 6th grade, and it was the first Jewish book that I read. Jewish being that it was the first book about Jewish characters that I read. Up until then, I was reading other things that had been, given to me by my teachers, and all of them were about, people who were not Jewish, Americans. And something about Hautzig's book really, really struck me. First of all, the fact that the family is Polish and they are deported to Siberia. So my family, my mother was actually born in Orsk on the border of Siberia in 1940. My grandmother, when they were deported from Krushnevitz, Poland, to Siberia, she was pregnant with my mother. My mother actually was in a children's home for the first 5 years of her life, and my grandmother would visit her once a week, and that was it. So my mother basically was brought up in an orphanage. So there was something about Hautzig's story that felt very familiar to me. Now, Hautzig was not in a children's home. They were in a village in Siberia, the way many Poles were in villages in Siberia. And they hardly had any food. They hardly had any water. I mean, it was a lot of deprivation and a lot of suffering. They were from basically a very posh kind of upper middle class family in Vilna, and now they come to Siberia and they barely have what to eat. And the idea is that they need to grow potatoes to last them through the winter, like grow the potatoes during the summer, have them last through the winter. And my grandmother would tell me these stories that she would dig for potatoes in the winter, and by the time she would get back home, they would be frozen. So there were these connections, like stories that I grew up with, and suddenly here was a book that was very familiar to me, that was about a family that could have been like my own family. My grandmother's family, they were butchers, so they were pretty well-to-do. And my grandmother would talk about her mother's fur coat. So again, there were these correlations, these connections between Hautzig's book and my entire upbringing, the world that I grew up in with these stories.
Where was your grandmother while your mother was in the home?
My grandmother was a laundress. They put her to work in the laundry. And I'm guessing that it was also this kind of village that Hautzig's family went to. There was hardly anything. There were a few huts. There was a marketplace. That was it. I had always thought that my family were in a gulag. That was how it was explained to me, that they were in Siberia, that it was a gulag. But the more, I actually reread Hautzig's book for today because it had been such a long time. And I realized, no, that my family must have been in something like a village like this. The way Hautzig's mother was placed in a bakery, that's where she was expected to work. My grandmother was placed in a laundry, and I remember her telling me that she was cleaning Soviet army sheets and uniforms, that was the bulk of what they were doing. Huge, huge vats. It was dangerous work because of the heat, the water, but at least it was warm during the winters.
And then tell me a little bit more about your family story. They went from there to Israel.
So this is the Ashkenazi part of the story, right? The Mizrahi is a totally different part of the story.
Yeah.
But the Ashkenazi part of the story is when they reached Siberia, my grandmother was placed as a laundress. My grandfather was drafted into the Soviet army. She did not see him for 5 or 6 years and was sure that he was dead. And they only met in Poland after the war in about 1946. She went back to Krosznewitz. She wound up meeting someone that the family had known before the war. And he asked her, well, how is Zev? That was my grandfather's name. And she said, oh, he's dead. And he said, what are you talking about? I saw him in the village last week, in this other village last week. And so my grandmother grabbed my uncle and my mother and basically went to the other village and found her husband. Wow. After years. They kind of knocked around Poland a little bit after the war, and around 1950, they made Aliyah to Israel. They had to wait for their visa in Venice for 9 months. And I remember my mother telling me how much she loved Venice, how beautiful it was. And then they went to Israel, and they were placed in a ma'abara, in a transit camp. My grandmother hated Israel. My mother loved it and really wanted to stay. My grandmother moved to America, and my mother met my father when she was about 16 years old. They worked together in Tasiyat Atzvayit, which was kind of the a military-industrial complex, where my father was actually, he worked for Uzi, the guy who actually created the Uzi, and he would test these guns, and that was his job. And my mother was working as a bookkeeper, and that's where they met. And they married when my mother was 17. Wow. My father was 26. And there's a whole story that kind of runs into the story of the Anatomy of Exile.
Yeah, I was going to say, because it seems like that family history made its way into both books. So maybe if you could just give us a little snapshot of your father's story.
So my father's story is that he was born in Damascus, Syria, in Haret El Yahud, in the Jewish quarter. And when he was 13 years old, he and his two younger brothers, my uncle Yossi and my uncle Ezra was 11, Yossi was 8. They were part of a program called Aliyat HaElef, or Miftzat Aliyat HaElef, which was Operation 1,000 Children. And this was an operation created by partly the Jewish Agency and an organization of Syrian Jews in Israel. And they tried to rescue, this was kind of the kinder transport of the Middle East. They tried rescuing 1,000 Syrian Jewish children. So my father was part of that. They crossed the Golan Heights on foot on June 6th, I think it was, 1945. Wow. And my two uncles were placed on Kibbutz Tel Yosef. That's kind of where they were absorbed first. And then after that, my father was placed on Moshav Balforia with a Czech couple. And he basically worked with the dairy cattle. He worked in the fields. And he was 13. They had promised him that he would go back to school. And I think he tried, but he was working so much that he never went back to school. And every Friday, he would either walk the 10 miles, or if there was a bus, or he could hitchhike to Kibbutz Tel Yosef to see his brothers, he would. He wound up learning fluent Yiddish living with that Czech couple. After that, I think he went from one kibbutz to another. He was part of the Palmach by the time that he was 16 years old. He had quite an interesting story.
Did he reunite with his family?
Well, I mean, they weren't allowed out. So right. He never reunited with any of his other brothers. They came after he already moved to the United States. We moved to the U.S. in 1961, and then his other brothers were able, one at a time, to actually get to Lebanon, and from Lebanon, sneak into Israel. So it was very difficult for Jews to leave Damascus. They were not allowed to leave. And if they did leave, they had to leave family behind, money behind. They weren't allowed to take anything with them except for one suitcase if they traveled. And being able to travel, they had to get permission from the government to do that. The other thing that finds its way into the Anatomy of Exile is the Arab village that I created there. So in the novel, the Arab village is called Kfar Ma'an. In real life, this is based on Sheikh Munis, an Arab village where Tel Aviv University now stands. And my family, my father, his sister's family, were placed on Sheikh Munis along with 200 other Mizrahi families. Sheikh Munis was abandoned by its Arab residents in March of 1948, just a few months before Israeli independence, in May 1948. And in 1949, after armistice, right, after the war kind of finally ends, they place these families on Sheikh Munis for many reasons. First, there was an influx of immigrants, and they actually needed places for them to live. There were many transit camps in Israel at the time, and they had these houses left by Arab residents, and they placed them there. And the other reason was a little bit more cynical in that it was a way to make sure that the Arab residents wouldn't return. So that history felt so, I guess, alive for me. It's something that I grew up with. When I went to Tel Aviv University, I was 18. I went back to Israel. And my father said, "Oh, I know that area. That's Sheikh Munis." And that was the first time that I had heard about Sheikh Munis. And so when I lived there, I would kind of think about what my father's life was like. And I actually had an apartment right across the street from a citrus grove. And I realized years later, my goodness, that was Sheikh Munis. I literally lived like across the street from there. So when I was writing The Anatomy of Exile, all of that history kind of bled into the novel.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, Great House by Nicole Krauss.
First of all, I've read the book a few times, many years ago. It's been a while, and I actually started rereading the book again so that I could, speak about it intelligently. It is my favorite of Nicole Krauss's books. And I think the reason why is that we have this chorus of voices, but at the center, there is this desk, this huge, ungainly desk that is endowed with everybody's loss, love, memory, war, all of these threads that I really connect to. All of the threads that I kind of try to bring into my own work. So again, it feels like this deep connection that I have with the story. The characters are all flawed. Some are bitter. Some are lost. Some are in love, unrequited love. It kind of encapsulates the messiness of life, the sense of trauma, post-war trauma. And it also speaks about Israel, like modern Israel, in the sense that we have these characters who've gone to the army, who've been traumatized by both war in Israel and also, other families that are traumatized by the Second World War. And the idea of second-generation trauma, I think, is really prevalent in the book. And this idea of trying to resurrect the past, that's kind of what the desk represents, this resurrection. For me, it was fascinating. It was a fascinating novel that she was able to pull off all of these threads and pull them all together at the end, I think just speaks to her mastery as a writer.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about structure.
Yeah.
That book the structure is really what conveys so much of the story. It's 4 separate stories. There are pieces that come together, but not entirely. Some of that reminded me of The World Between and how things kind of come together, different time strands. I wonder, as a reader, what you make of that structure, how you understood that it conveyed the story.
So I think that, first of all, it's called Great House. And the idea that a house is built brick by brick, the structure that she uses, each character has 2 stories that they tell, right? So it begins with Nadia and it ends with Weiss, but again, Nadia has, in the second part of the book, has another story that she's telling. And it's the same thing for all the other characters. That structure, I think, gives us a sense of breadth, this time span that extends outward. I think it's the way memory works, right? That we don't remember things necessarily in a linear way. We remember memory in pieces, right? When I think of family history, I think of a plate dropped, shattered, and you're trying to put the pieces together, right? And that is definitely what I try to do in The World Between. It's this puzzle. And I think Nicole Krauss's book, it feels more structured than The World Between, in the sense that The World Between does feel like these shattered pieces. Krauss's book, I think, is very structured in the way. The architecture, that's what I want to say about it. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of architecture to the story, to the novel, and it is this great house that spans an enormous amount of time.
I pulled a quote which really stuck with me from that book. I think it's attributed to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai.
Yes.
In the story, who was a first century sage. It says, but if every Jewish memory were put together, every last holy fragment joined up again as one, the house would be built again. Or rather, a memory of the house so perfect that it would be, in essence, the original itself, a perfect assemblage of the infinite parts of Jewish memory. We live, each of us, to preserve our fragment in a state of perpetual regret and longing for a place we know only existed because we remember a keyhole, a tile, the way the threshold was worn under an open door. So I wanted to ask you about that fragmentary sense of inheritance and how you think of that in your own Jewish life or imagination.
I recently reread that passage as well, and I thought, oh my God, she absolutely nails it. I think that Jewish memory somehow, that there is this collective. I didn't mention the word Holocaust in my novel, The World Between, but we all know what I'm talking about. Right? And I'm talking about a different aspect of the Holocaust, Siberia, which is different than, let's say, the camps, very different. And I think this idea of collective memory is what makes us a people. Our memory is a repository, and it is this huge great house of memories. And we all have, whether it's Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, all of us have this collective unconscious. And that, for me, was how I was writing, I think, The World Between. I didn't have a set, like, this is what the book's going to be about. This is the plot. It took a long time to create the plot. I allowed it to just come out of her own memories, of the character's own memory. And she's an unnamed narrator. And so there is this sense of the every woman or the every person of the Jewish story about childhood war trauma, about Aliyah to Israel, about Yiddish, about the stage, about Jewish creation, Jewish creativity.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka.
I've taught The Metamorphosis. I've read The Metamorphosis. I think it is probably one of the best and most perfect stories. I mean, there's a lot of great, great stories out there, but I think Kafka was prophetic. And I read Kafka as a Jewish reader. I know that he's kind of been adopted by the rest of the world, but I really see Kafka as a Jewish writer, even though there is no mention of Judaism in the story. It is essentially, I think, a story about Jewish suffering and about the idea that the world can change on a dime. And I think he was prophetic in seeing that. He wrote that like in the middle of the First World War, and I'm sure there was a ton of anti-Semitism in the Czech Republic at the time. And I know, reading from his diaries, I know that he had avid interest in Yiddish theater. He often went to the Yiddish theater. In his diaries, he would speak about going to cafes and talking to other Jewish writers and other Jewish friends like Max Brod. And his entire world was ostensibly a Jewish world. He doesn't mention it in the work itself, but the idea of suddenly waking up as vermin, as a roach. I mean, to me, again, there's this prophetic sense to the way that he's writing about the world. And what he does is he creates a microcosm of society in that one family. It is a brilliant story. You could read the story from, and this is kind of the way that I've taught it, from a Freudian lens, in the relationship between Gregor Samsa and his father, and his relationship with his mother, the love that Gregor Samsa has for his mother, the idea that what he wants is comfort from her, and the father being jealous and standing in the way of that. You could read it from a feminist lens in the sense that his sister Greet becomes this, finally, after he turns into this big cockroach, that she becomes empowered. She begins to go out to work. The family can no longer depend on him. And so they turn away from him when he's no longer useful. And then finally, you can read it from a Marxist point of view in the sense that now that he is no longer viable, economically, financially, he is done away with. He is no longer worthwhile. So in that sense, I think there are so many levels that you could read this story on. To me, it speaks not just about that era, but it's as if the story is like a stone that you drop into a lake and reverberates outwards, in these currents. And I think we still see that today. I mean, after October 7th, we still see this kind of everything turning on a dime, right? The anti-Semitism that we see in the streets. So, again, I just feel like Kafka understood what it meant to be the other in society.
That's what I was thinking of when I saw that this was what you chose. The themes in your books of alienation and alienation from oneself and home and exile. I mean, those are so strong in everything that you are writing. I'm curious when you first read it and if it had that impact on you the first time you read it.
So the first time I read it was in my early 20s when I was in school. And then afterwards, I actually worked in a Beis Yaakov school, and I taught high school students, and I needed to find a book that was kosher, right? And so I decided I was going to teach these Beis Yaakov girls about Kafka.
For those who don't know, it's an ultra-Orthodox girls' school.
That's right. And I had a wonderful time teaching that. And then after that, I worked in an all-girls seminary, also Orthodox. And they also, I found it so interesting the way these young women related to the story. They understood it immediately. And I think in that sense that no matter what group you're teaching this story to, that people get it. Because at some point or another, we have all been othered. We have all been estranged. We are all exiled emotionally or physically, psychologically.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Your Presence is Mandatory, by Sasha Vasylyuk.
So right now I'm reading Sasha Vasylyuk's book, Your Presence is Mandatory. I am almost done. It is such an amazing book. I'm really enjoying it. I love, again, the structure, the fact that we move from present to the past. And I love this idea that someone who has been taken prisoner, Yefim, who's been taken prisoner, is actually considered as persona non grata in the Soviet Union because he either wasn't killed on the battlefield or wounded on the battlefield or maimed on the battlefield. To me, it was a fascinating story in that sense. She's done such a good job. She really does. She's a beautiful writer.
Book 5, the author's latest books, Anatomy of Exile and The World Between, by Zeeva Bukai. In both books, the characters lose an anchor, land, home, child, language, and they're forced into a reckoning with the self. And those themes, as we've started to talk about, are really powerful in both novels. And I'm wondering how they resonate for you in your own life, having spent time in Israel and here.
So for me, the idea of exile is really important. Not just exile, but being the other in a new place. I came here when I was 3.5. I did not speak English until I was 5.5. The first 2 years, I was kind of insulated with my family, and we were speaking just Hebrew. I read Hebrew. I had already started reading. I went to school, to kindergarten. I couldn't speak the language. The idea was I was going to learn it, and of course I did. I learned English. But I remember very much this sense of being out in the cold. Like literally, like physically feeling that I was cold, that I was not part of kind of that warm circle, in school. And in the first and second and third grades, they would take me out of class for speech therapy. So again, I was, in a sense, everybody would look like, where is she going, right? And I was taken out of class for reading because I had a difficult time reading. And it really took a while for me to feel that I had entered American society. So that feeling of being the stranger in a strange land was very potent for me. And I think that that kind of comes out in both books. This sense of the Nishtahain, Nishtahel, right? The sense of straddling, not the here and not the there, but straddling both worlds. So that was, how do you translate a feeling like that into fiction? And that was something that I tried to do. In both books, the anchor is marriage, but they both lose that anchor. Both Tamar in The Anatomy of Exile and the unnamed narrator in The World Between. The other thing is that love becomes an important element in both stories. For The Anatomy of Exile, you have 3 love stories, 2 between Palestinians and Jews, and they kind of bookend the novel, and the great love story between Tamar and Salim, which I do see as a great love story, this marriage, an intense marriage between the two of them, an intercultural marriage, and the sense of exile that Tamar feels within her own marriage, because she is not Mizrahi, she does not speak Arabic, it is a world unknown to her, and so Salim remains unknowable to her, and she feels adrift because of that. And she feels adrift, again, because she's in the United States. She's in a new place. She's trying to hold on to these pins, right? She desperately tries to hold on to her Israeli identity.
I want to pick up on that and ask you about the children in the novel. As you mentioned, there are these love stories, both Hadass, who is Salim's sister, and Ruby, who's Tamar's and Salim's daughter. They're young. They fall in love with these Palestinian men. And there's a sense that the kids might lead the adults out of conflict, and then various things happen, and that doesn't happen. The work is so hard, I guess, in leading the grown-ups out of their conflict. Do you feel hopeful about a younger generation being able to do that?
I think it depends on education, right? I think it depends on how you're educated. If we're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, I think that the only way we'll be able to get out is not necessarily through governments, but on the ground. It's why I picked kind of love stories, kind of the Romeo and Juliet trope. I think for me, The Anatomy of Exile ends with a lot of hope with regard to Ruby and Faisal. Whether they'll get together, whether, what will happen with them, we don't know. But there is this sense of possibility. And I think that once you have a sense of possibility, then anything can happen. I think after October 7th, it's going to be a heavy lift, a really heavy lift. I was just recently in Israel, and there's this great sense of resilience, I think, among young Israelis. But whether it can move into something like that, I'm not sure. I think we do have a lot of coalitions and coexistence going on in Israel between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. So I think there's a lot there for us to be very hopeful for. What will happen with Palestine-Israel, that is a whole other story.
Yeah. The Anatomy of Exile is expansive and political and multi-voiced, and The World Between is intensely interior and compressed, and it's told kind of in an inner monologue addressed to her estranged husband, Max. I'm wondering if you learned something from writing the first book that impacted how you wrote the second book.
So, one, I wanted to write a shorter book. That wouldn't take 10 years, right? And so this one did not. And I learned a lot from writing the first book. You actually learn how to write a novel by writing a novel. Otherwise you can read as many books about novel writing, but until you actually get into the trenches, It is a beast that you need to wrangle. So in writing the second book, I decided that I wanted an interior story, even though there is a lot of interiority in the first book. I mean, that's just my tendency. But I really wanted to explore a woman who is on her own and what that means. And I didn't want to talk about the Mizrahi side. I didn't want to talk about Israel-Palestine in this book. I really wanted to just see what would happen when this woman returns to her home in Tel Aviv and kind of go with the flow there. It really was a discovery for me. With the Anatomy of Exile, I had this family, and I'm always, by the seat of your pants kind of writer. I don't plot things out. But once I get to about 100 pages, I begin to, okay, this is what needs to happen now, right? So I sort of plot the end of it. For this book, I did not do that. The ending was as surprising to me as any part of this story. Every character that came into this story was a surprise to me. What does it mean to have a childhood relationship with someone and go through that kind of trauma? What happens afterwards? So those were some of the questions that I asked myself as I was writing this story. And the story, unlike the Anatomy of Exile that was written kind of in these bigger chapters, these were very, very short, kind of punchy little chapters, these letters, essentially, that she was writing to her husband, Max. This idea of writing to someone gave the narrative an energy that I really liked.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit before the phrase nicht dahein, nicht daher, which is Yiddish. It means neither here nor there, and the book is called The World Between. That feels like the emotional core of the book. What lives in that space for you?
So when I was teaching at Brooklyn College, I had an Orthodox student in my class. And somehow or another, we began talking about Kabbalah and what happens to the soul. His father was a rabbi teaching at Harvard. And this was a super, super bright young man. And he told me this story about what happens to the soul, that the soul rises up out of the body and shatters into thousands of pieces. And then it waits to adhere to other pieces of souls. And so this idea that we're all part of each other was fascinating to me. Now, he told me this story about 25 years ago, and it remained with me. And I thought about that story as I was writing The World Between, and this idea of the nicht dahein, nicht daher, the world, kind of these shattered souls that are just waiting, right, in this, the Christians would call it a kind of purgatory, not heaven, not hell. And for me, it's not that. It's not a purgatory. It is literally the liminal space between earth and heaven, and this sense of waiting. Right? That sense of almost like a breathlessness of waiting. And I really feel that the narrator here embodies that.
It's interesting that it goes back to the fragments that we were talking about earlier and the shattering into a million pieces. I know that you have a background in theater.
That's right.
Right? And this book is set in the Yiddish theater. And the Yiddish theater was in its prime probably many years before the book takes place. The narrator goes back to their time in the Yiddish theater was in what decade? Maybe the 60s?
Probably in the 60s, yes. Yeah. Already it was fading. And the idea is that there is already a sense of loss. For me, they probably go to America at the end of the 50s, and so they're there the 50s, 60s, 70s. And the book actually takes place in the early 90s when she returns to Tel Aviv. But she does talk about that era. So there is this sense of people trying to hang on to the Yiddish theater, but it is already beginning to fade. At its height, I think there were over 120 theaters in the Lower East Side. I mean, it's quite amazing when you think about it. And they used to call it the Yiddish Rialto. It was incredibly vibrant. And there were actors that were able to make it over from Yiddish theater into Hollywood. Mary Picone being one. Stella Adler was, born into a Yiddish theater family. Her sister was considered the first lady of Yiddish theater. And I think kind of in American theater, we have these Jewish, Yiddish actors and actresses and playwrights and songwriters, Irving Berlin, all of these people who are so, I think, energized by what's happening in America in terms of theater and are contributing to it in such a positive and energetic way. I mean, it was really exciting at that time.
And so why set it in that locale? Why set it in the theater?
I think in the theater you're taking on different personas. The unnamed narrator is deliberately unnamed, right? She has no name here. She's just she or I. And this idea of taking on personas, of kind of losing yourself in a character is, I think, what happens to her. We lose ourselves in memory. We lose ourselves in the past. We imagine who we could be, who we are. I think all of that is prevalent in this character. I think it's the core of her. She's not just a Yiddish actress, she's also an Israeli actress. And she winds up acting in the play Medea at the Habima Theater. And all of this feels very close to me because when I was studying theater in Israel, I studied with Binyamin Semach, who was quite old at the time. He was a choreographer and an actor, and he was the brother of Natan Semach, who was one of the founders of the Habima Theater, along with that early Moscow troupe that went to Israel like in 1910 or something like that, and they wind up creating the National Theater of Israel. And there I was, kind of having this connection because of Binyamin Semach, who came and taught us a couple of classes, and he was a really interesting person. And I kind of based Max on him because I remember going to Habima one night, and I can't even remember what we were seeing, but I remember seeing him there. And he was kind of a short fellow. He wore a black fedora, and he wore this cape. And his wife, who was absolutely stunning and statuesque, towered over him. And it was just this perfect image. It was just this great image that I've always remembered. And that's Max.
Were you studying to be an actress?
I did. I studied acting for 10 years. And when I came back to the States, I continued studying acting. And I have a BFA in acting from Brooklyn College. And I did quite a bit of theater while I was there and really loved it. So, yeah. And I really feel that a lot of my own writing craft comes out of acting craft.
I see that. The World Between is so much more, but it is also a character study in a
absolutely.
Very intense.
Yeah, in a very intense way.
Yeah.
Microscopic in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So if Anatomy of Exile asks readers to widen their moral and political imagination, what are you hoping readers take away from The World Between?
I think that I want people to look at the ramifications of childhood war trauma. What are we doing to children? And what do they grow up like? Are they capable of having relationships? Are they capable of being good to themselves, of being good to others? I think at the center of this book is the loss of children and the loss of childhood and innocence.
Well said. If I could just ask you one last question, what feels most meaningful to you about your Jewish identity right now?
Everything, being here. I feel that writing Jewishly feels like an act of resistance now. I think being Jewish in the world feels like an act of resistance. And every day, that's who I am. I feel like that's the identity that I embody. Everything I write, everything I do feels like it comes out of that core.
I appreciate that so much because I think even in what you just answered about The World Between, you also so much appreciate that our Jewishness is meant to be able to be expansive in how we see everyone in the world. And that's what both of your books, I think, are asking us to do. And they make demands of the reader in how we think about, our moral obligations. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I think you've read them exactly the way I want readers to read the books. The world is hard, and we need to embrace each other. And I think it's really important for Jews to stand with Jews now. It always has been, but at this moment in time, it's astonishing what's happening. And I feel readers who get my work, I feel embraced by them, and I'm so grateful to all of them, for reading the work. There have been readers who've had a hard time, most especially with the Anatomy of Exile. Jewish readers who've had a hard time with it, and I understand it. Not everyone is going to appreciate that sense of expansiveness, of being able to look at each of us as humans. And I would hope that the other side does the same. I mean, that's, the humanity of it all. Isn't that what Bartleby the Scrivener says at the end? Humanity. I mean, that's where we are.
Well, I hope people take away just those messages and read both of these books. And they're a gift to all of us readers. So thank you for sharing them with us.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Zeeva Bukai, talking about her books Anatomy of Exile and The World Between. You can find a link to the books and all the others Zeeva discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we've discussed and some other great recommendations directly in your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.